Today, we're doing a deep dive into something called continuation of pay, or COP. It's a critical benefit under the Federal Employees Compensation Act, that's FECA, and the OWCP regulations, the Office of Workers' Comp.
Exactly. And our mission today is really to pull out the absolute must-know facts from all those, dense government documents, agency guides, and even real-life examples. We want to make sure you walk away understanding exactly when and how this vital benefit applies to you, and crucially, how to avoid the common pitfalls of things that can really cost you.
Yeah, those pitfalls are key. We've waded through the official regulations, Department of Labor guidance, specific case rulings, even union resources. We're getting right to the core of what you need to know, fast. Okay, so let's unpack this crucial first distinction, because right off the bat, you need to understand that COP isn't available for every type of work-related injury. It's strictly tied to the kind of injury you have.
That's absolutely critical. Under FECA, there are basically two main categories. First, you've got a traumatic injury. Think of this as something sudden, specific, caused by an event or maybe a series of events, but all happening within a single workday or shift.
Okay.
Like a slip and fall, maybe, or that one time you lifted something way too heavy, that kind of thing. And this gets reported on Form CA1.
CA1. Got it.
Then the second type is an occupational disease or illness. Now, this is different. It's a condition that develops over a period longer than one work shift, usually due to workplace factors. Think repetitive stress injuries like carpal tunnel syndrome or maybe prolonged exposure to something harmful. These are filed on Form CA2.
Okay, CA1 for sudden, CA2 for gradual. And here's where it gets really interesting for your pay. COP is only available for those traumatic injuries. The Department of Labor is crystal clear on this. They say continuation of pay is not applicable in instances of occupational disease or illness, full stop.
And the practical impact for you is massive. If you have that sudden one-time injury, the CA1 type you might qualify for up to 45 days of COP. That means your regular pay keeps flowing, hopefully without a major interruption. But if your condition developed over time, the CA2 type, you're not eligible for COP, period.
Wow. So what happens then?
Well, in that case, you'd have to use your own sick leave, maybe annual leave, or even go into leave without pay, LWP, while you wait for OWCP to approve your claim for compensation.
Ouch. That could be a long wait.
It can be. And, a natural question comes up. Why make this distinction? Why only COP for traumatic injuries? It really boils down to providing immediate financial relief for those sudden acute incidents, the ones where your income might otherwise just stop abruptly. COP gives you some breathing room.
Okay, that makes sense. So we know it has to be a traumatic injury, filed on a CA1. But just having the right kind of injury isn't enough, is it? Next, we need to talk about the absolute bedrock of getting this benefit, the strict timelines. This seems to be where most people get tripped up.
Absolutely. You said it. Timeliness is everything with COP. There are several non-negotiable deadlines. First, the big one, the 30-day reporting deadline. You must file written notice of your traumatic injury on Form CA1 within 30 calendar days of the injury date. That's to preserve your rights to COP.
30 calendar days, not working days.
Calendar days, correct. And this is a bright line rule. Missing this 30-day window means you automatically lose your entitlement to COP. Even if your overall injury claim itself can still be filed later, maybe up to 3 years under FECA, for the long-term comp benefits, for COP, that 30-day window is it.
And no exceptions. Like, what if someone is seriously hurt?
No exceptions. It sounds harsh, but the rulings are clear. Not even severe incapacitation or maybe your agency messing up and not telling you. None of that can extend the 30-day COP deadline.
What?
It's a huge pitfall. We see people miss this way too often. Okay, so that's the first deadline. Next, let's talk about the 45-day COP period and the start window. So if you qualify and it's granted, COP is paid by your employing agency, not OWCP directly, for a maximum of 45 calendar days of lost wages.
I did calendar days.
Yes, calendar days. So weekends, holidays, they all count if they fall between your days off work due to the injury. Now, the day of your injury is usually covered by administrative leave. So your first actual day as COP is typically the first full day or shift after the injury that your disability keeps you from working. But here's the absolute make or break rule for starting COP. Your very first day of work stoppage due to the injury must happen within 45 calendar days of the injury itself.
Ah, okay. So if I get hurt, but I push through for, say, 50 days before I finally have to take time off.
Then you cannot use COP for that time off. Exactly. You'd have to file for regular wage loss compensation using Form CA7 instead. COP is off the table if the first absence is after day 45. And another crucial detail, that 45-day clock, It's relentless. It doesn't pause if you go back to work for a bit and then need more time off.
So intermittent absences don't stop the clock.
Correct. Any partial day of absence usually counts as a full day of COP used. And interestingly, even if you choose to use your own sick or annual leave instead of electing COP, those days still count against your 45-day total entitlement.
Okay, that's tricky. So 30 days to file the CA1, first absence within 45 days of injury, and a max of 45 calendar days total. What else?
One more key timeline. The 10-day medical evidence rule. After you file that CA1, you must provide supporting medical evidence to your employer. This evidence needs to show you had a traumatic injury and that it's causing your inability to work. And you need to get that in within 10 calendar days of submitting the claim.
10 days. That's fast. What if the doctor's appointment isn't for 2 weeks?
It's tight. If no medical documentation is provided in those first 10 days, your agency actually has the right to suspend or deny your COP.
Oh, okay. But is it gone forever then?
Not necessarily. Here's some good news. COP can be reinstated retroactively if you furnish that required medical evidence later on. But you'll have a gap in pay until you do.
Okay, that makes sense. So the pressure really seems to be on the employee to meet these tight deadlines. What about the agency? Do they have deadlines too?
They absolutely do. Your agency has its own duty. They're supposed to forward your completed CA1 form to OWCP within 10 working days of receiving it from you. And if they plan to challenge your right to COP, they need to include that challenge when they send the form.
But what if they miss their deadline? Does that hurt my COP?
No, and this is critical for you to know. If you filed your CA1 on time within that 30-day window, your agency's failure to meet their 10 working day deadline does not negate your right to COP. You did your part.
Okay, that's important.
Yeah.
Now let's talk paycheck. What does COP actually look like? Is it just my regular salary?
Pretty much, yeah. It's designed as a continuation of your regular pay, paid by your employer through their normal payroll system. So unlike the OWCP compensation checks you might get later for long-term wage loss, which are generally tax-free, COP is subject to all your normal taxes and payroll deductions, retirement, health insurance, etc.
Right. And what happens if the 45 days run out and I'm still unable to work?
Good question. If you exhaust those 45 days and you're still disabled, you would then typically transition to leave without pay or LWOP status. And at that point, you'd need to file a Form CA7 to claim wage loss compensation directly from OWCP for ongoing disability.
Okay. Now, what if? What if I get COP, but then OWCP later denies my underlying injury claim? Do I have to pay it back?
That's the provisional part.
Yeah.
Yes, if OWCP ultimately denies your claim, any COP that was paid out can be charged against your sick or annual leave balance. Or if you don't have enough leave, it could be deemed an overpayment that you'd likely need to repay.
Oof. Okay, good to know. Before we move on, I've heard there might be specific rules for certain groups. What about, say, postal workers? Anything unique for USPS employees with COP?
Ah, yes, that's a very common point of confusion, and it's important. For USPS employees, there is a unique 3-day waiting period for COP. Generally, you won't receive COP for the first 3 days of disability. However, there's a catch. If your disability ends up lasting beyond 14 calendar days, or if it results in a permanent impairment, then those initial 3 days are retroactively restored as COP.
Interesting. So a waiting period unless you're out for more than 2 weeks, basically.
Essentially, yes. It often causes confusion, but it's important to remember that all the other COP rules, the 30-day filing, the 45-day start window, the 45-day total limit, they still apply just the same to postal employees.
Got it. Okay, so we know the injury type, we know the timelines. Who actually qualifies for this? It sounds like it's not automatic, even with a traumatic injury. You mentioned criteria.
That's exactly right. There are several criteria, and the key is you have to meet all of them to be eligible for COP.
All right, let's list them out.
Okay. First, you must be a federal civilian employee of the U.S. government at the time of injury and covered by FECA. This includes most postal workers. Certain groups, though, like some volunteers, maybe people in specific training programs, they might be excluded by law. And importantly, COP isn't payable if your federal job already ended before you report the injury.
Makes sense. What's next?
Second, as we've hammered home, it must be a traumatic work-related injury. That sudden event, single shift, CA1 type, and it has to arise in the performance of your duty.
Right, so tripping in the agency parking lot might count, but tripping at home wouldn't?
Generally, yes, although parking lot cases can sometimes get tricky depending on specifics. But injuries from purely personal activities, definitely not. Third, there must be no willful misconduct or intoxication involved. If your injury was caused by your own willful misconduct or, intent to hurt yourself or someone else, or if it was primarily caused by being intoxicated from alcohol or illegal drugs, you won't get COP or likely any FECA benefits.
Okay, that seems straightforward.
Fourth, and we can't stress this enough, Form CA1 must be filed within 30 days. Missing it absolutely, positively bars COP. No excuses.
Heard loud and clear, 30 days.
Fifth, the lost time must have begun within 45 days of the injury. Remember, that first absence has to start within that 45-day window after the injury date. If your symptoms pop up later, like day 50, no COP for those absences.
Okay.
Sixth, you need to provide supporting medical evidence. You've got that 10-day deadline after filing the claim to give your employer medical documentation showing the injury and, crucially, your work limitations. Proof you can't do your job because of it.
10 days for medical proof. Got it.
And finally, number 7 involves your election and employment status. You have to actually be in a pay status when you get injured. Also, if you're on, say, a temporary appointment that expires while you're on COP, or if you resign, or if you're terminated for cause, your COP stops on that separation date. You also can't be off for disciplinary reasons. And critically, you must elect COP on the CA1 form itself.
Oh, you have to check a box.
Yes. There's a section where you choose COP or using your own leave. Now, you can initially use your sick or annual leave and then later ask to switch to COP. You have up to a year to make that request. But honestly, most injured workers are wise to elect COP right away on the CA1 to avoid burning through their own leave balances unnecessarily.
And the agency should tell you about this choice.
They absolutely should. They have a responsibility to inform you of your right to elect COP versus using your leave.
Okay, so if you manage to check all 7 of those boxes, then your agency must continue your regular pay for up to 45 calendar days.
That's a rule. If you meet all those criteria, COP is mandatory for the agency to provide.
So it really is like a form of administrative leave, kind of, to bridge that gap until OWCP processes the longer-term claim.
That's a good way to think about it. It bridges the gap.
But as you said, it's provisional. Getting COP doesn't automatically mean OWCP will approve the whole claim down the road.
Exactly. It's a temporary pledge, not a guarantee of final acceptance.
Right. Okay, so even if someone does everything right, or thinks they did, things can still go wrong. Let's talk about the minefield. What are the common reasons COP gets denied, or maybe started and then stopped unexpectedly?
Yeah, navigating the pitfalls. Unfortunately, there are quite a few common reasons, but knowing them is half the battle. The most frequent reason by far for COP denial is late filing, missing that 30-day window for the CA1.
Still the biggest one.
Overwhelmingly, filing on day 31, day 32, it automatically disqualifies you from COP. And as we said, there's really no grace period, no good cause exception that OWCP recognizes for this specific benefit. You might still get regular FECA compensation later if your claim is approved, covering wage loss, but COP itself, forfeited. That immediate pay continuation is gone. It's probably the single biggest takeaway today. File that CA1 immediately.
Okay. What else trips people up?
Another common issue is the claim not being recognized as a traumatic injury. Maybe it gets misclassified initially. For example, maybe you filed a CA2 for an occupational disease when it really was a sudden traumatic event. Or maybe your agency reports it incorrectly, perhaps saying it happened off-duty when it didn't. OWCP has the final say on classification, of course, but any initial misclassification by you or the agency can definitely cause delays or denials of COP. This can get especially tricky with things like repetitive strain injuries that maybe felt like they happened suddenly.
Right, the lines can blur sometimes.
They can. Then there's simply failure to notify your employer timely, not telling your supervisor quickly after the injury happens, or sometimes the agency itself drops the ball. Maybe they fail to give you the CA1 form promptly, or they don't advise you properly about your COP rights. Now, if the agency fails here, that's a procedural error on their part, maybe grounds for a grievance like we'll discuss. But legally, it does not extend your 30-day deadline for filing with OWCP to get COP. Lack of awareness, unfortunately, isn't an excuse under the law.
So you still have to meet the deadline, even if your supervisor didn't help.
Correct. That's why being proactive is key. Another big one, insufficient medical evidence. This ties back directly to that 10-day rule we talked about. It's a very common reason COP gets cut off after it's started. If you don't submit medical evidence that clearly supports your inability to work because of the traumatic injury within 10 days of filing the CA1, your employer can terminate your COP.
But you said that can be restarted.
Yes, thankfully. The good news is it can usually be restarted retroactively once you do provide that sufficient documentation. But in the meantime, you've got a gap in your pay, which is obviously stressful.
Yeah, definitely. What else?
A surprising one for many employees is when the work stoppage begins after 45 days. Remember that rule. If you get injured, file the CA-1 on time, but you don't actually lose any work time until after day 45 post-injury, you're simply not entitled to COP for those absences. This often catches people with delayed symptoms completely off guard. They think, I filed on time, but the start of the absence matters too.
Okay, that's a subtle but important one.
Very. Agencies can also controvert COP. This means they formally challenge your entitlement to it. They have to state specific reasons, and there are only certain allowable grounds, things like late filing, arguing it wasn't work-related, maybe alleging misconduct. Sometimes agencies challenge COP improperly without a valid reason based on the regulations. But the good news here is that OWCP makes the final decision. They can review the agency's challenge and direct the employer to pay COP if the denial was wrong.
So the agency doesn't have the last word on controversy?
Nope, OWCP does. Okay, then there are the less common but possible reasons. Like if the injury was due to your willful misconduct or intoxication, if that's proven, both your COP and your entire FECA claim will likely be denied. And finally, employment or status changes can end COP prematurely. If you're on a temporary appointment and it expires, or if you resign, or if you're removed for cause during the COP period, your COP stops on that date. And of course, it stops if you recover and return to work.
Okay, what about recurrence? If I go back to work and get hurt again?
Good question. There's an important nuance here. If you return to work after a COP period, and then you have a recurrence of that same disability from the original injury, you can potentially get COP again for any unused balance of your original 45 days. But, and this is the key part, that recurrence of disability must happen within 45 days of the date you first return to work.
Within 45 days of going back to work?
Exactly. If the recurrence happens, say, 50 days after you return to work, no more COP is payable for that recurrence. Even if you still had days left in your original 45-day bank, you'd have to claim regular compensation instead.
Wow, that's another very specific timing rule.
It is. It catches people by surprise.
So, listening to all this, it really sounds like most of these COP pitfalls aren't necessarily about how badly you were hurt, but much more about, administrative process, missing deadlines, miscommunication, technicalities.
Precisely. That sums it up perfectly. While the injury itself is the trigger, the process is where things most often go wrong with COP. Prompt action and thorough documentation from you, the employee, are crucial. And on the other side, proper information and timely processing from your agency are equally important. It really requires both sides to be on the ball. Being proactive is your best defense.
Okay, let's try to bring this home. Can we look at some real-world examples? Seeing how these rules actually play out in specific cases might help make it all clearer.
Absolutely. Examples are key. Let's start with that strict enforcement of the 30-day rule. We keep mentioning it because it's so critical. There are numerous cases from the Employees Compensation Appeals Board, the ECA, which is the final arbiter for FECA disputes, like a frequently cited one involving William E. Ostertag. These cases consistently, repeatedly reinforce that there are no exceptions to that 30-day COP filing deadline. They've looked at scenarios like a brand new employee who just didn't know the process, or a supervisor who failed to help them file, even cases of severe incapacitation where the employee literally couldn't file. NECDA has consistently said those factors are irrelevant to the 30-day COP rule.
Irrelevant. Wow, that's tough.
It is. The practical insight here is crystal clear. File that CA-1 immediately. Don't wait. Even if some details aren't perfect yet, get the form submitted within 30 days. You can always provide more information later.
Okay. But this raises that important question again. If someone does miss that 30-day COP window, is all hope lost financially?
No, not entirely. And this is important to stress. While missing the COP deadline is definitely costly because you lose out on that immediate, uninterrupted pay, it does not affect your underlying entitlement to regular FECA compensation for wage loss later on.
So you can still get paid eventually?
Yes, eventually. You might have to burn through your own sick leave, your annual leave, maybe go on to LWOP for a while. But once OWCP accepts your overall injury claim, which has a much longer filing deadline, remember, you can file a Form CA-7 to claim compensation for those periods of lost wages. It just significantly delays your income replacement, which is still a major hardship for most people, but it's not a total loss of benefits in the long run.
That's a crucial clarification.
Yeah.
Okay, what about that agency responsibility piece? You mentioned a USPS example.
Yes, this is a compelling one, involving a USPS letter carrier who wasn't informed of his COP rights. In this actual case, a carrier got injured on the job. His supervisor, however, failed to follow agency policy and didn't advise him about his right to elect COP on the CA1. So the carrier, being unaware, just used his own sick leave instead. By the time he learned about COP and tried to request it, that 30-day deadline had passed. Predictably, OWCP denied his COP claim based on late filing.
Okay, so OWCP followed the rule.
Right. But here's where it gets interesting. His union, the National Association of Letter Carriers, NALC, filed a grievance against the Postal Service over the supervisor's failure. And the arbitrator in that case, Claude Ames, actually ruled in favor of the carrier. He ordered USPS to reinstate all the sick leave the carrier had used and basically convert it administratively to COP because the supervisor's failure to inform him was found to be the proximate cause of the COP denial.
Wow. So even though OWCP said no COP, the union grievance essentially made him whole.
In terms of his leave balance and pay status, yes. This case is powerful because it highlights that agencies do have internal duties to inform employees, and if they fail in that duty, there might be remedies through union grievance procedures or other internal EEO or administrative processes, even if OWCP itself won't bend the strict 30-day FECA rule for COP.
That's a powerful distinction indeed. A potential avenue, even if OWCP says no. What about the medical evidence issue?
Right, the medical evidence and COP termination. Let's take a scenario where an employee's COP gets suspended because maybe the initial doctor's note was vague or a more detailed report wasn't submitted within that 10-day window. It's really important to know that official OWCT guidance explicitly states that if COP is terminated solely for lack of timely medical evidence, it shall be reinstated retroactive once that supporting medical documentation is provided.
Shall be reinstated, so it's mandatory.
That's the language in the guidance. So if your COP gets cut off for this specific reason, the absolute key is get that detailed medical documentation supporting your disability for work in as soon as possible. Then, proactively request reinstatement from your agency or OWCP. Many federal workers have successfully gotten their COP turned back on retroactively this way.
Good to know there's a fix for that one.
Yeah.
What about when the agency just disagrees, they controvert the claim?
Yes, controverted COP where OWCP decides in the employee's favor. We see these too. For example, maybe an agency denies COP for an injury that happened in the employee parking lot, arguing it was off-premises and therefore not work-related. The employee appeals, or OWCP reviews it. OWCP looks at the specific facts. Was the employee required to park there? Were they coming directly to work, etc.? In many such cases, OWCP has found the injury was in the performance of duty and has instructed the employer to pay the COP, often retroactively.
So again, the agency's initial no isn't always the final answer.
Definitely not. OWCP has the final determination on COP entitlement under the law.
Yeah.
If you believe your agency improperly controverted or denied your COP, it's often worth pursuing it with OWCP. They can and do overrule improper agency denials.
Okay. And just briefly, for those occupational disease cases, the CA2s where we know COP isn't an option, are there common strategies people use to manage the income gap?
Yeah, since COP isn't available, employees with occupational conditions like carpal tunnel often have to plan more carefully. A very common strategy is to use their available sick leave, maybe even request advanced sick leave if the agency allows it, to cover the time off while the CA2 claim is pending. Then, once OWCP approves the CA2 claim and starts paying compensation, the employee can use that compensation payment to buy back the sick or annual leave they used during the waiting period.
Ah, so they get their leave balance restored later.
Exactly. It requires having leave available up front or getting advanced leave and planning for that potential income gap, but it's a standard way to manage financially while waiting for an occupational disease claim approval.
Okay, that's helpful context. So wrapping this all up, what does this really mean for you, the federal employee, listening right now, trying to make sense of this?
Well, COP is, without doubt, an incredibly valuable benefit. Getting your pay continued immediately after a traumatic injury can make a huge difference. But, as we've seen, it is absolutely loaded with strict eligibility rules and quite a few procedural hurdles. If there's one core takeaway from digging into all these regulations, manuals, and cases, it's that timeliness is paramount, especially that 30-day initial filing deadline for the CA1. The rules on timing are strict, and OWCP consistently enforces them with truly no exceptions when it comes to COP.
Yeah, it really seems like the vast majority of COP denials we discussed boil down to missing deadlines, maybe some miscommunication between the employee and the agency, or sometimes just a lack of knowledge about your rights in this really intricate process.
That's exactly it. And it highlights that both employees and agencies have responsibilities here. For you, the employee, being proactive is your best defense. That means reporting the injury immediately, seeing a doctor promptly, getting that CA1 filed within 30 days, submitting medical evidence within 10 days, and keeping your agency informed every step of the way. And for the agencies, their key duties are to properly inform employees of their rights, provide the necessary forms quickly, and process the paperwork and any controversy according to the regulations and timelines.
Wait, it really sounds like that old saying fits perfectly here. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Just knowing these rules, understanding the deadlines, and acting quickly within those timelines seems like the absolute best way to ensure you actually receive the continuation of pay you're entitled to if you suffer a traumatic workplace injury.
Couldn't agree more. And maybe this raises an important question for you, the listener, to think about even before an injury happens. How can you proactively make sure you're prepared? Do you know where to get the forms? Do you know who to report to immediately? Just thinking through that now could make all the difference if something suddenly happens on the job.